I'm gonna have to level with you all for a second and say that I am not smart enough to play puzzle games. Sure, falling block puzzle games aren't really that much of an issue, but those are designed to be real easy to get into, and the skill ceiling is basically only dictated by how far you can go in an endless mode until you fail. Of course, this doesn't take into account playing against other players or AI, but that's an entirely different beast altogether. No, the sort of puzzle game I'm referring to are ones where you are given all of the tools and information needed to solve a problem, and then asked to solve it using a very limited restriction on the tools that you have been given. These puzzles have endings, clear conditions. Yeah, those are the sorts of puzzle games I'm just not good at. I always feel like I do whenever I'm playing a game of chess. I can look at the board and I can think a few steps ahead and connect the dots, but I can't think far enough ahead to see the end game from the start. And I often find myself ignoring or forgetting about crucial elements during the middle of a puzzle that often put me in an unsolvable situation later on. And yet, I can't help but be drawn to them. I enjoy the challenge. I enjoy the feeling of being stumped and trying to worm my way through it to that aha moment. I do find puzzle games fun, even if more often than not, I just find myself either not completing them or having to consult a guide to help me out later on. And one of my earlier experiences with the genre, other than Tetris, was a small series of games way back on the NES, the Adventures of Lolo series. Created by HAL Laboratories, yes, the same HAL that is responsible for the Kirby series of games, the games started out as part of the Eggerland series of puzzle games for the MSX, a popular Japanese home computer of the day. And once Nintendo hit the scene, a trilogy of games were produced for the Famicom, and then a separate trilogy of games was produced here in America, and renamed to The Adventures of Lolo. While there were 9 games released for the series in Japan, America only got these 3 homegrown games. We never saw any localizations of the other games, aside from one small Gameboy title a few years after the NES trilogy. And now we're going to talk about them all, starting with the very first one released on the NES, the original Adventures of Lolo. Well, this is a very boring title screen. The game itself is fairly simple. You play as Lolo, a blue, blobby thing, who has to rescue Princess Lala, a pink blobby thing, from the Great Devil, who is, well, a devil. Lolo infiltrates the devil's castle and needs to work his way through 10 floors of 5 rooms each to reach the boss and rescue the girl. He does this by pushing blocks, sealing enemies into eggs, and picking up these heart tiles. Like all good puzzle games, Lolo is pretty simple to understand. Your goal in each room is to pick up all the heart tiles and then grab the pearl from the treasure chest, which will destroy all the enemies in the room and open the door to the next area. After clearing 5 floors, you move on to the next floor, with an encouraging message letting you know that you're nowhere near the end of the game. Lolo doesn't really have any inherent way of defending himself, unfortunately. He walks at a decent pace, but he has no method of attack initially. In some rooms, but not every room, mind you, picking up a certain number of heart tiles, or just a specific heart tile, will grant him a certain number of power shots, usually 2 per pickup, which allow him to fire at an enemy and encase them in an eggshell. While encased, the enemies can then be pushed around and moved like the regular green blocks strewn about the castle, and can be temporarily dispatched by shooting the egg a second time, and can even be used as temporary bridges or boats in rooms with water obstacles. But again, not every room has these, and you're usually only granted enough of them to complete the given puzzle, as your tally resets when you enter a new room. You can also earn other power-ups as well, such as the ability to change the direction of certain floor tiles that you can't walk over in the opposite direction that the arrow is pointing, a single bridge tile that lets you cross water, and later lava, and a hammer that can be used to destroy certain rocks. Again, these are only available in certain rooms and you only receive what's necessary to complete the puzzle. But it's not all block pushing and bridge building. You have enemies to worry about, and this is where things start to get a little bit more complicated, as every enemy is different and the way they operate is really something. Not every enemy will try to kill you, at least not right away. The biggest danger these wormy guys here pose is just blocking off certain paths. These stone blocks with the dopey faces can't kill you, but they'll run straight towards you if they see you from above or below, and when they're close to you, they stop moving entirely, which can box you in if you aren't careful. These green imps will hop around whatever area they're in, but if they can make a beeline for you, they will, and if you touch them, they will permanently fall asleep wherever they are, which makes them immune to your power shot and can block you off from being able to enter critical areas. But make no mistake, there are enemies that are dangerous. These Medusa heads will instantly kill you if you cross their path in any of the 4 cardinal directions, unless their sight is blocked by another enemy, a block, or a boulder. These pink demons operate the exact same, but will constantly move up and down or side to side. These armadillos are just like the green imps, but they'll actually kill you if you touch them. But the most insidious enemies of all are enemies that are harmless at first, but can kill you later. Usually after you collect the last heart panel, requiring you to avoid them on your way to the pearl. These dragons are asleep most of the time, but after you pick up the last heart panel, walking in front of them will have them spit a fireball at you that's impossible to dodge if you're not a certain distance away. These skulls are probably the scariest. They're dormant until you pick up the last heart, and then they will immediately come alive and start chasing you all over the room until they either kill you or you grab the pearl. If the enemies don't kill you, you might find yourself in a position where the puzzle just becomes unsolvable, either because you didn't use your shots properly, didn't pick up the panels in the right order, or misplaced a block or an enemy. In a situation like this, you'll be using the select button quite a bit, as it's your handy suicide button, and you'll probably be using it a lot. If you run out of lives, and you most likely will at some point, the game is actually pretty generous. If you run out of lives, you can just choose to continue, and you'll restart the puzzle that you were on last. There's also no score to worry about either, and while you can't pause the game at all, the enemies in a room won't start moving until you do, so you do have the ability to at least look over a room before you begin. You also don't have to worry about a time limit either, which is very generous for this type of game during this time period. All of the game's 50 puzzles are based around learning enemy behavior, exploiting that behavior, working around them, and any other obstacles in the room, learning which order to do certain things, and then grabbing everything you need. However, some of the enemies are tougher to manipulate than others, and there's also several instances where you need to rely on fast reflexes, such as performing a few movements before an egg cracks, or simply outrunning an enemy to the goal. Unfortunately, while the logic puzzles are fun, this aspect can make this part of the game a little needlessly frustrating. This level right here, for example, gets my vote for worst puzzle in the game, as it's not even really a puzzle. It's just you and an enemy chasing you around the map. You have to outrun it to the heart panel and then beat it to the pearl before it kills you, and you can't mess up that much. You have to be damn near perfect to beat it, which is tough when this game's control isn't really made for precise movements. Don't get me wrong, the game controls just fine for what it is, and you can move in any of the 4 cardinal directions easily enough, and it's very responsive, but maybe a bit too responsive. See, you actually aren't locked on a grid in Adventures of Lolo. Instead, you can take half steps forward, and you can also push objects and enemies in half steps as well. This is pretty useful in some situations. Since enemies can't pass over heart panels, and you only collect one when you are fully on the square where it rests, you can sort of half-stand on it while waiting for a good opportunity to grab it. Medusas and devils can't instantly kill you unless you're fully within their gaze, so you can actually half-block them with a block or another enemy and still be able to pass by them unharmed. However, Lolo can't push something unless he's fully aligned with it. So if you're a half step off, it's like running into a wall. This has actually defeated me far more than anything else in this game, accidentally pushing something a half step into a position that I can no longer reach it in, forcing me to restart the puzzle. And yes, if you die or choose to restart a room, you start over from the very beginning, regardless of how far into the puzzle you were, even if you grabbed the pearl. If you didn't grab the pearl and walk through the exit, you're starting over. Trying to shoot a power shot at an enemy when you're not fully aligned with them will also result in you missing the shot as well, so making sure you're properly aligned is pretty important, but that can also be tough to do in situations where you have to perform several actions in rapid succession under time pressure, especially in rooms with instant kill enemies or lots of Medusas. Later puzzles have so many moving parts, it can feel a bit overwhelming to try and keep track of everything. But as the first entry in the NES series, I do think the game has a very good difficulty curve, and I was actually able to complete a majority of this game without consulting a guide, which I consider a good sign. Yes, later puzzles were challenging, but they weren't so overtly complicated that I got frustrated. The entire game from start to finish is puzzles too. There's no boss battles, no big gameplay change-ups, it is a straight-up no-frills puzzle game, despite the game teasing you with a fight on the last floor of the castle. Graphically, the game is kind of plain, which for a 1989 release on the NES and Famicom is kind of understandable. Yes, this was the same year as Ninja Gaiden's release, but a lot of developers were still going for relatively simple, pixelated looks. I mean, the opening cutscene for the game is pretty nice at least, but there's little attempt at shading for the characters, and most of them just use a single flat color for their looks. And there's little in the way of graphical effects, too. When you grab the pearl, for example, all the enemies just disappear. Oh, and every single floor of the castle uses the exact same graphical theme for its levels, with no variation anywhere in the game. Not to say the game looks bad, and I mean puzzle games aren't necessarily known for varied environments, but it can be very tiring to look at the same thing for so long, especially if you find yourself replaying the same puzzles over and over again, which I did. Most of the puzzles, even the later ones, can be completed in under 5 minutes if you know what you're doing, but you can easily spend over 10 minutes trying to parse out the correct way to solve some of the more difficult ones. And the whole time you're trying to solve it, you're going to be hearing the exact same theme from the beginning of the game to the end. While there are some other themes in the game, most of them are incidental, such as the quick 5-second victory theme you get when you clear a floor, or the theme from when you beat the game, of course. But the game as a whole has you listening to this single track, which loops every minute or so. I will give the developers credit, you actually don't have that track restarting every time you enter a new room. Instead, the music continues to play until you clear an entire floor or lose a life. So that is actually kind of impressive considering how many games at this point in time would just restart the loop after every single room. But it's all you hear. Don't get me wrong, I don't think it's a bad composition, and it's pretty jaunty too, but the problem is how often you hear it without a break from it, and how often it loops around. You get tired of it very quickly, even as you make progress deeper into the lair. Despite its problems, most of them are cosmetic. The appeal of a puzzle game is in the puzzles themselves, and while I do think the more action-oriented puzzles can be a touch frustrating at times, most of the time the game is really fun, even if you're like me and struggle with finding the logical conclusion to most of the problems at times. We're not going to spend too much time on Lolo 2, as it's pretty identical to the first game in almost every aspect. Gameplay, control, even the story itself is pretty similar. The Great Devil returns and once again kidnaps Lala, and Lolo needs to go and rescue her, this time ascending a giant tower to a castle floating in the sky. Gameplay is exactly the same as the first, and I mean exactly the same, with no significant changes to the control or puzzle layout or anything. It's the ultimate version of if it isn't broke, then don't fix it. There isn't a single new enemy in the game, and the only new obstacle appears much later in the game, lava flow, which you can't use enemies to cross, and if you build a bridge over it, the bridge will burn up and disappear after a set amount of time. The lava levels are also often accompanied by these crumbling bridges, which will break if you walk over them multiple times. And the only other addition gameplay-wise? There's a boss fight this time. Okay, it's only at the end of the game, and it's super easy, but it's better than beating the big bad in a non-interactive cutscene after you finish the last puzzle. Where the game has improved is in its presentation. While the game flow is exactly the same, go through room after room to ascend the tower with no breaks in between, the presentation is actually a bit nicer. Yes, the rooms are exactly the same, and yet again, there's no change in aesthetic no matter how high you get up the tower. but everything's been polished up to look a bit more detailed and a bit better animated. Even the death animation looks a little bit better. There's even a nice little poof animation when the enemies disappear when you grab the pearl. The sound design is also much better, with the sound effects feeling more full and not quite as dated as in the first game. And they even got a new tune to play during gameplay this time. And once again, it's all you hear throughout the entire game. While it sounds a bit better than the tune from the first game, it will eventually start to wear on you over the course of your playtime, especially since you'll probably be hearing it a lot more than the song from the first game. While Lolo 2 is about as long as the first game in terms of its overall content, the puzzles in this game ramp up the difficulty and complexity a lot quicker than they did in the first game. I found myself consulting a guide a lot more often to finish this game off, and while I still found it fun, I did feel like the puzzles were getting a little bit too complex for their own good later on, something that was a bit more noticeable due to playing the game so close together, one after the other. Speaking of one after the other, let's move on to Lolo 3, and oh, this is different. Very interesting. While again, the core design of the game remains exactly the same as 1 and 2, like literally exactly the same, this game actually has a lot of new stuff thrown in. First off, the story is actually a bit different this time. The Great Devil returns a third time, but rather than just trying to kidnap someone, he uses his magic to transform everyone in Lolo and Lala's home to stone, with the two of them setting off to try and stop him yet again. And yes, I didn't misspeak, you actually have both Lolo and Lala to play as in this game, and can switch between them whenever you want in the overworld. And yes, this game has an overworld, more on that in a sec. While it's mostly just a cosmetic swap, there's actually a really surprising part in this game, where you enter into an unwinnable boss fight and whoever you were playing as ends up kidnapped by the Great Devil, meaning if you were playing as Lolo, then it's time for Lala to be a solo hero. The story presentation overall has been given a big upgrade, with transitional cutscenes used to lead you along from one area to the next. It's a small touch, but it does make the game feel more like a long adventure, with actual stakes rather than a disconnected series of puzzles. Like I said before, the game also features something of an overworld, though there isn't really a whole lot to explore here. All of the different levels are labeled in the order that you should play them in, and you do have to play them all to progress, since certain levels have objects that you need in order to move forward. For example, you can't get into level 3 until you've obtained the key in level 2, and you need the rainbow egg from level 1 to make a rainbow bridge to cross to the next area of the game. So while there is some non-linearity in the stages that you can do, the difficulty ascends with each level, and it's generally just best to play them in the order that they're labeled in. There's also, surprisingly, 2 optional levels that are dedicated tutorial stages, presenting you with very simplistic puzzles designed to teach you the very basics of the game and how everything works, something that is good for new players, though not necessary for anyone who's played the first 2 games in the series. And oh my god, would you look at that, we have a second skin for the dungeons. Yeah, there is actually one variation in level theme this time around, though it's a theme that sticks with you for much of the latter half of the game. And during the rest of the game, it's the same red floor with boulders and bushes that we saw in the first 2 games. They did add in a new enemy for this new level theme though, a big green fish that will suck you towards them if you cross their path, which did lend itself well to making some of the more, shall we say, taxing puzzles in the game. But other than that, if you're familiar with the first 2 games, nothing else of note has really changed. The game does run a bit more with the boss theme from the end of the last game though. Not every level ends with one, but a good majority of them do, and all of them are basically larger versions of regular enemies that you fought before, though in some cases it's a bit of a downgrade. While all of them can kill you on touch, the Medusa can no longer kill you on sight, instead just letting out waves of energy and teleporting around, for example. One detail that I do really like about the boss fights is how they end, though. Bosses based on enemies that you can encase in an eggshell will be encased in one at the end of the fight, and you have to fire off several more shots to send them flying off and win the fight. But if you're fighting a boss based on an enemy that you normally can't put in a shell, they'll simply explode into nothingness. That's actually a cute attention to detail, and I like it. Musically, the game is also a little bit more varied, helped by the fact that you have a longer break between levels this time around. While you're in a level and moving through puzzle rooms, you do still hear the same music over and over again, and yes, it's the same tune from Lolo 2, but it's at least broken up by time spent out on the adventure field and near level entrances, which helps the music feel a lot less monotonous this time around. I should also note that this game is a lot longer than the first two, with quite a few more puzzles to figure out, and the difficulty curve feels a lot more unbalanced. I once again had to consult a guide to finish this game, but unlike with the first game where I checked one occasionally to get past some of the endgame puzzles, or with 2 where I had to check more frequently, I basically had to have a step-by-step guide open the entire second half of Lolo 3. The puzzles here are much longer and much more complex than anything I saw in the first 2 games, and there are a lot more of them. The game overall is just longer, which in and of itself isn't a problem, but man did I feel drained after finishing it. It's also the only one of the 3 that I just could not finish in a single sitting, though a part of it might have been burnout after having played the first 2 games. But I did definitely notice a steep curve upwards in difficulty in this one. The NES trilogy is fun though. Any one of these 3 games is guaranteed to get you to spend some real thinking power, but I wouldn't recommend playing them all one after the other. But I would definitely recommend the first one over the other 2 if you're more like me. The second and third games do look and sound better, but from a pure gameplay perspective, if you have difficulty with puzzles in general, the first game feels a lot more welcoming. I'd normally end it here and start my wrap-up spiel, but we've actually got one more thing to take a look at. A majority of the Eggland series was never brought to North America, but other than the NES titles, we did get one more game 3 years after Lolo 3. It was a single entry on the Game Boy, merely titled The Adventures of Lolo. Now you'd be forgiven for thinking that meant it was just a belated port of the first game. Heck, I originally wasn't going to cover it here because I just assumed it was a port as well, but no, it's actually its own standalone game, so let's give a quick look to Adventures of Lolo on the original Game Boy. Well, right away it steps away from the NES trilogy by actually having Lolo talk to you. The game doesn't really have a story this time, it's more like a bunch of theme stages that don't really connect, but progressively come together to create some sort of connecting idea. For example, all of the intermediate level puzzles are themed around different kinds of music, and when you beat a stage, you complete a melody themed around that type of music, such as hula, house, and oriental music. And oh my god, they finally figured out how to put in more than one song per stage. It's fantastic. The music even changes in each stage depending on whether you're standing out in the open or in a flower bed, the safe zones for this game. It's a great touch, especially for a Game Boy game. It also features something that the NES trilogy didn't have, and that's a very expansive tutorial level. It's skippable, yes, but if you go for it, it will dedicate a stage to every enemy, obstacle, and power-up in the game, thoroughly explaining to you how they operate, and even having a computer-controlled demo stage to show off how these things work and how best to utilize each element. Yes, Lolo 3 on the NES did kind of have this with the optional tutorial stages you could find there, but to be fair, they didn't really explain or demonstrate anything to you. They just set you in a room with a very simple, basic puzzle and let you parse it out for yourself. And the only way you'd know ahead of time how anything in these games worked was if you still had the manuals for them. So really, despite its lack of a cohesive narrative, the level of depth that they put into easing in new players and the added spice with the soundtrack really makes this game stand apart from the NES games, which is good because otherwise it is pretty much just Lolo on the Game Boy. I'd say the difficulty is on par with the second game on the NES, at least from what I saw. The game also moves at a slower pace. Lolo himself moves much slower, as do the enemies, which I actually kind of like. Since the game still has the half-step system for how Lolo moves, I found myself messing up far less frequently when moving Lolo around and pushing stuff around. This might also be me, but I think that the puzzle rooms themselves are also a bit smaller this time around, which makes them feel a little easier to parse out and solve. Heck, the game even allows you to ask for hints by pushing the select button, rather than just automatically restarting you, though that option is here as well. Alright, the hints are incredibly basic and don't really help you solve the specific puzzle you're on, but it's something. I don't think I'd take this version over the first or second NES games, but I will say that I find this version very fun for a portable puzzler on the Game Boy, and the transition from a home console to a handheld didn't hurt the game's feel overall that much. I'd say check it out if you're curious. Sadly, that's all we really got here in America, and at the time of my writing this, the series has been dormant for about 2 decades. The last official release was a Japan-only game for Windows back in 2000, and nothing's really been mentioned about the series since. Lolo and Lolo would go on to make some cameo appearances here and there in other HAL games, most notably as recurring boss characters in the Kirby games of all things. But even that dried up after a few appearances. In fact, as far as I can tell, the last notable appearance these characters had in anything were as minor, and I mean very minor, recurring characters in the anime Kirby Right Back At Ya. It's been a few years since I watched any of that series, so I can't say for sure, but other than them commenting on things that were happening in the episode, I don't really think they were given any sort of big focus there. And that's about it for the Adventures of Lolo series. It does have a few small flaws, many of which are indicative of the age that they were made, but they are still really fun puzzle games, and I am kind of sad to see the series lay dormant and forgotten at this time. You'd think that sort of thing would come back as, say, a mobile game, or maybe a release on Steam. These sorts of games seem to crop up in those places quite a bit. Then again, with HAL's close association with Nintendo, maybe it's not that unusual. If you want to try these games for yourselves, and I do recommend giving at least the first game a try if this looks like it appeals to you, well, that's going to be a bit tough if you want to avoid emulation. The first game actually isn't too expensive, and you can score a decent copy for around $10 to $15 if you're patient. The second game, though, I rarely see for under $30, and the third game, it's been a while since I've seen those for less than $50. Loose cartridges for the Game Boy version don't crop up super often, but they're usually priced around the same as the second game. So, far more expensive than a Game Boy game really should be. If you don't want the physical copies though, you're kind of out of luck there. The first 2 games were actually available on the Wii's Virtual Console, but as of January 2019, that service is kaput, and they were never moved over to the Wii U, so if you didn't grab them by now, you're SOL. The third game and Game Boy title were never re-released either, and considering how little HAL seems to re-release their old games that aren't Kirby titles, I don't hold out hope of seeing Lolo and Lala resurface again anytime soon. Again, it's a shame because they are fun games, so long as you don't marathon them, of course, and are a great example of the sort of logic puzzle games you'd see cropping up a lot more often from major developers back in the day. It sort of seems like these games are more the indie creators' playground now. But hey, Bubsy came back, and I'm convinced that if he can get a new game, anyone can. Screw it, Adventures of Lolo Remaster for 2021, let's make it happen! See you all next time, everyone.